mitzar ma'od. Your beginning, says God, was very narrow, very small. V'acharischa yizge ma'od. But your latter days are mighty and powerful. That was fulfilled in this shul. I think of the millions of words of prayer emanated from the sanctuary and that wafted its way up to heaven. Prayers of anguish and prayers of hope and prayers of gratitude and prayers of desperation. I think of the bar mitzvahs that took place up here, the bris milos, the weddings on this spot. I think of some weddings that took place in the middle of the bride's or groom's shiva period for a parent on this spot, where the community came together and tried to bring joy to a couple that was getting married, that was grieving. And I think of one wedding way back when I was standing right here. The bride and groom were facing me. And I noticed that the bride was doing this, swaying back and forth. And like this, and like this. And I said to myself, I didn't know that she was that frum, that she's davening, under the chuppah, but it could happen. Then the groom whispers to me, he says, Rabbi, she's fainting. He says, she's fainting, make it fast. So I whispered to the mother to hold on to her daughter, and I made it fast. I read the brachas at Olympic speed. And after the wedding was over, I walked down here, a man came up to me and he said, that's what I like, a nice brief ceremony. I remember many faces on Shabbos mornings listening in rapt attention to my sermons, and it made one very proud. And I remember many other faces. You already know what I'm going to say. You were one of those. Their eyes were closed, their mouths drooped open, their head was tilted to one side. I'd only said good Shabbos, and they were. And that makes one very, very humble. One Yom Kippur day, I was in a Bible-thumping mood, you might call it, and I was mentioning that I didn't understand how men who never can get up to go to shul Shabbos morning get up real early to get good tea time in the golf course on Shabbos morning. And how come they never come to shul? I was really upset. And I said, and I don't understand why women can only find time for their hairdressers on Shabbos at noon and never can come to shul. And I was haranguing. And later it was reported to me that one lady leaned over to her friend as I was haranguing and said to her friend, for this I got dressed up to come to shul. And one of the most ludicrous Yom Kippur memories, and vivid, happened during Unasana Tokef. Who will live and who will die, very touching, moving prayer. And the man opening the ark that day was a wonderful guy, not terribly religious, but wonderful person. He was an avid sports fan. And as a side income, he was a gambler. Not a bad gambler, but he gambled, especially on sports. This happened to be, this Yom Kippur was the 7th game of the World Series. And Joe, we'll call him Joe, that's not his real name, was standing right here. Ark was open. And he had his moxer in his hand. And he is really, davening. He's really into it. And I was thinking to myself, I never knew Joe to daven like this before. It must be a spirit of Yom Kippur, Sanatoka. Then Sanatoka was over, we closed the ark. He came over to me, shook my hands. Then he whispered the following immortal words into my ears. Yankees 4, Dodgers 3, bottom of the 7th. Then he whispered further, Rabbi, I got money on the Dodgers, pray hard. He was a wonderful person. Whatever he made in gambling, he always gave 10% of that gambling to Shul. That was his insurance policy. And then many of you will remember the famous Ne'ilah. You remember? What am I talking about? The power went out late afternoon on Yom Kippur. The sun was setting. No lights. There was no power in the whole neighborhood. Our custodian brought in, thoughtfully, a large candle, placed it on the middle table here. And we all stood for an hour in the Elah. The only one who could see the words was Shoel Bleichbart. You remember him? Who was the chazan? And the whole congregation was still and perfectly quiet and solemn and serious with Ne'ilah, though they didn't see a prayer book. And everyone was just following word for word, and Shoel was terrific. He used his intelligence. He was a very bright guy. He said things very slowly, and everyone followed with him. It was a beautiful Ne'ilah. Everyone who was there remembers it, will never forget it. So there are many, many, many memories that crowd up in the mind as I stand here on this same pulpit. Ordinarily, a good rabbi inspires his congregation. In Beth Jacob, it was the reverse. You inspired the rabbi. Particularly inspiring was the sight of men and women who began adopting more and more Yiddishkeit into their lives, who moved back into the neighborhood, who brought into their homes Jewish traditions that weren't there before, who began keeping kashrus and Shabbos and mikveh, and began studying Torah more. And I appreciated what they were doing because I knew what it meant to say no to one's own past, and often to fight one's own family, to fight one's parents, or sometimes to fight one's children, but mostly to fight parents who felt rejected by a child who was going in a more traditional direction. And one person came up to me years later and said, Rabbi, Shabbos is such a joy. Why didn't you force me to keep it earlier? And I was inspired by a few men who took it upon themselves to stand on their feet all day Yom Kippur. All day, from early morning till after Ne'ilah, stood on their feet. Never sitting down except for the sermon. I said to one of them afterwards, I said, Jack, why don't you stand up for my sermon? A little respect. So you know what he said? I can't sleep while I'm standing on my feet. And I was especially inspired, and still am, by individuals, men and women in this shul, who through thick and thin stuck with us, even though they weren't always in agreement with the trajectory of the shul, which way we were going, but they stuck with us because they knew we had integrity. I was inspired by that and grateful for that. So we've come a long way, lahodos ulahalel, to thank God and to praise Him. I'm almost finished. I took a little more than 12 minutes. More like 12 times 12, but that's all right. You know, in the famous dispute in the Talmud about how to light Hanukkah candles, do you go from 1 to 8, which we do here, which we Jews do all over the world? You start with 1, and every night you add 1, which is the view of Hillel, or the view of Shammai. You start with 8 and go down 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Dispute. And each one has a point of view. I might say that the one who starts with 8 and goes down to 1 is the one who's always talking about the good old days. Oh, I remember when Beth Jacob was, better, and so forth and so on. The good old days were always better than now. Of course, you should know that when we get older, today's going to be the good old days. Keep that in mind. That's Shammai. But Hillel, with whom the halacha agrees, whom the halacha follows, says, look, the best is yet to come. You start with 1, you work up to 2 to 3, you work all the way up to 8. From 1 to 8, always forward, upward. And we hold with Hillel. Jewish life holds with Hillel. We're going forward, always upward. Let me close with a story, a personal story. But first, let me get a drink of water, which is dangerous because I could go another half hour on a little sip. That is, when our son, Amram, olav shalom, was about 4 or 5 years old, in the middle of Yom Kippur afternoon, he came running down that middle aisle, yelling a blue streak. I remember it was Emmanuel Miles, olav shalom, some of you may remember him, grabbed Amram, and Amram was yelling, and he grabs little Amram and put him on his shoulder and starts walking with him out to get him out of the shul. And I'm sitting up here, I can't do anything. And Amram is kicking and screaming. And he says, let me down, my father is the boss of this shul. Because he always saw me sitting up there, I'm the boss of the shul. I'll come back to that in a minute. But my good friends, my loving friends, it has been a wonderful trip. These 50 years, actually for me, it's been a trip of, and for Estelle, it's been a trip of 60 years. It was 10 years earlier we had come to Atlanta, in 52. But here it's been a wonderful trip in this wonderful building, which is still an awesome, inspiring structure. And I love you all for being there when we wanted you and when we needed you, for your loyalty and your sacrifice, your volunteering, your patience, and your love. And all of us realize deep down that the real boss of the shoal is our Father in heaven. He guided us and helped us, as I said, in so many tangible ways. And that's the only reason, as Rabbi Lon mentioned earlier, that we have come such a long way. May he continue to bless us with long life, with good health, individually and collectively. And may we be together for many, many years to come. Amen. For good things, continued spiritual growth, continued material health, and let us continue to enjoy one another to the eternal strength of our people, of our God, and of the destiny of Am Yisrael. Thank you all very, very much. Yeah, I've given many speeches in this show. I never was applauded. Thank you.
Shus, Rabbi Emanuel Feldman, Rabbi Ilan Feldman, I have to say it is truly a privilege for me to share this pulpit with both of you, and it is rare, I should say it's actually common in all of your professions. Every once in a while you feel completely humbled and undeserving of the positions that you have, and it is an evening like this that I feel completely undeserving of sharing this pulpit with you, and I thank you both for the opportunity to learn both from you and serve this very holy congregation. Thank you very much. It's about 12 years ago, almost to the day, that Rifki and I spent our first Shabbos here in Atlanta. We had come invited by Rabbi Meir Neuberger to interview for the not yet existent Kollel in Or Yisrael, and to be perfectly honest with you, we had absolutely no intention of ever moving here. But we experienced something that first Shabbos, and we both went back home to Baltimore and said to ourselves, there was something there. There's something different about this community, about this shul. It's unique. You don't find it anywhere else. And I have to tell you, I've heard that sentiment over and over and over again from guests, from visitors, from your family who comes to spend Shabbos here. They tell me, they tell Rabbi Feldman, you have something special here. It's not like what you find everywhere else. What is that? In honor of this occasion, I sat down to think to myself, what is it? Put your finger on what is so special, so unique, so different about this community. The first thing I knocked out was it wasn't a sports community. That was clear. I looked at the educational brochure, pretty impressive, full slate of educational programs, and while it says a lot about our community, other communities have educational brochures as well. I thought about the warmth, the fact that when a guest or visitor walks in, he'll be approached or she'll be approached by numerous people introducing themselves, inviting them to their home for a meal for Shabbos, Southern hospitality at its best. And it creates an environment here. But I don't think that's all that makes this community unique. There's a tremendous amount of Torah learning that takes place every given Shabbos. Every minyan, 3 minyanim in this shul have a class before or after, partnering with the Atlanta Scholars Kollel. Throughout the week, there are numerous opportunities, overwhelming number of opportunities. You could see the youth, over almost 100 kids in shul every week, various programs throughout the week, young families, children in the building. I don't think that's what it is either. When you think about this shul, Beth Jacob represents a family. It's a community. It's the heart of a community, of a home, a spiritual home. And when you have the heart of a spiritual home, with learning, with prayer, as Rabbi Emanuel mentioned, the thousands and thousands of prayers that have been offered on this spot, lives are touched. Individual lives, family lives are impacted. It's a shul that's not static at all. Every once in a while you visit a community that you haven't been in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and you go back and it's exactly the way you left it. The place is the same, the people are the same, just a little bit older. This shul is dynamic. I've heard from people who come back 5 years after being away, 10 years, 20 years. They might walk into this sanctuary and say, looks exactly the same as it did 35 years ago, and we're about to change that. They might say the songs you sing during davening are exactly the same you sung 35 years ago, and we just changed that too. But the people, when they talk about the people who you see, the changes that they've made, the families that have been impacted, the steps, the growth that they've experienced, and that we've experienced as a community, that is something special. The shul is alive. It's dynamic. It's changing. And it's because you are alive and dynamic and changing. And the two rabbis, Feldman, giants in the American rabbinate, have created an environment, a fertile ground where people grow. People are inspired, and they want to be inspired, and they want more. It's an attitude that exists that when you walk in, a visitor feels it. They can sense it. This is not a place where people come to daven and then go home. It's a home. It's a spiritual home. It's the heart of a community. You see it in the davening Friday night, in the singing. You see it in the dancing, people who want to celebrate Shabbos. They're excited that the end of the week has come. They're not ready to run home and just go to sleep. They want to be part of something. There's an energy in the air. It's contagious. People from the outside, we're used to it already. From the outside, they come in. You have to hear what they say. You have to see their faces. You have to see the energy that they reflect that we have. And it's something special. And I'm not only referring to, as Emmanuel mentioned a few moments ago, families who came in who were far from Torah Judaism and who have taken steps. Supplies to families who have come, who have seen what goes on. Families who moved in the last 10 years, 5 years, this past summer. Families who have been religious their whole life. And they find here a fertile ground to grow, to change, to develop. And it's inspiring to us, to the rabbis. I have to tell you, I'm about to, a month from now, celebrate my 6th year as the assistant/associate rabbi of the shul. It's a long time. Longer than the shelf life of many associate and assistant rabbis around the country. And when I speak to friends, colleagues around the country, and they find out 6 years, they say, what are you still doing there? When they start asking me that here, then I know that it's time to leave. But right now, here, I don't get that question. The people who ask that question don't know the city of Atlanta and the congregation of Beth Jacob. Someone who knows this congregation would never ask, why are you still here? I am here because this is the most special congregation that I've ever been a part of. Because the people here, are looking to change, to grow, to be inspired. You're looking for more from a rabbi than just to answer a question, but for a relationship. Through the challenges of life, through the difficulties of life, to develop that. And particularly, I've had a chance to learn to grow with all aspects of this community, from the youngest to the eldest members, in classes,